He was a man molded by silence, a man shaped by long, bitter years of loss and isolation. The wilderness of the Montana plains was a harsh and beautiful place, a land where ice and wind dictated the rhythm of life and death. Winter came early that year, swallowing the earth whole with its blanket of snow. The lone figure that emerged from the mist was a ghost of a man named Caleb McGraw. A widower, a veteran of too many battles, both external and internal. His heart was as weathered and cracked as the old planks of the tiny log cabin he called home, a place buried deep in the heart of nowhere, a beacon of smoke rising from its chimney as the only sign that a human being still refused to surrender to the silence of the mountains. Caleb had long ago learned to survive alone. The years had stripped him of warmth and conversation. His wife, Anna, had passed in childbirth 10 years ago, and the boy she bore came and went like the wind, taken by the cold and the cruelty that often stalked the land. Since then, Caleb kept to himself. The world beyond the pines held too many ghosts and too many memories. The only company he kept now was a rifle resting by the door and a faithful, aging hound named Buck, whose slow tail wag and patient gaze were enough to break the silence from time to time. That morning, the wind was howling as it barreled down the mountainside, sounding like a chorus of wolves in the distance. Caleb pulled on a worn buffalo hide coat and stepped out the door, brushing away the crust of ice that had gathered across the threshold. Buck followed faithfully, nose low to the ground. It was bitter cold, the kind that gnawed through bone and refused to release its grip. Yet Caleb had to tend to the woodpile and set a few snares before the storm worsened. It was while he was hauling a fresh load of wood to the stack that he spotted something at the edge of the woods. At first he thought it was a fallen branch or a heap of ice, but Buck growled low and pushed toward the figure. Caleb tightened his grip on the rifle and stepped closer. As he rounded the fir tree, he stopped in shock. A woman lay half buried in the snow, tangled in a tattered shawl that offered almost no protection from the brutal cold. Her long black hair was matted and crusted with ice. The color of her skin spoke of heritage. She was Apache, a proud and resilient people. Yet the scene before him was one of desperation, a tragedy suspended in the stillness of winter. The woman was unconscious, her breathing shallow, her lips faintly whispering words that the wind carried away. Caleb sank down beside her and quickly shrugged out of his coat, wrapping it around the woman's fragile frame. He pressed 2 fingers to the side of her throat. Faint, but there was a pulse, a tenuous thread of life that refused to be extinguished. Without hesitation, he scooped her into his arms and rose to his feet, Buck trotting beside him, barking sharply as if urging him to hurry. Through the blinding snow, Caleb retraced the path to the cabin. The woman weighed almost nothing, yet every step felt like a lifetime as the wind surged and clawed at them. At last he pushed through the door and laid her down upon a bed of furs. The warmth of the hearth embraced the room. Buck shook the ice from his coat and settled down close, resting his nose upon the woman's hand as if to guard her. Caleb worked quickly. He peeled away the icy layers of her clothing, wrapped her in fresh blankets, and set a pot of water to boil. As he tended to her, brushing hair away from her brow and checking her wounds, he noticed faint marks across her wrists and arms, deep abrasions that spoke of a struggle, of cruelty, and of a desperate escape. Whatever she had run from, it had nearly claimed her life. Yet she had refused to succumb until the wilderness placed her upon Caleb's path. Through that long, bitter night, the widower kept vigil. The woman would stir from time to time, murmuring in a tongue he only partially understood. Apache words for fear, for loss, for home. He offered no reply, no intrusion, only the silence and warmth of the cabin. Buck refused to leave her side, resting close to her hand, sharing the warmth of the fire and the beating of a heart that refused to extinguish. As the hours passed and the storm raged, Caleb felt a strange warmth stir within himself, a warmth that had been buried under ice for years. The sight of this wounded, frightened woman ignited something long thought lost, a sense of belonging, a faint whisper of purpose. It was as if the wilderness had placed her upon his path for a reason, a reminder that even in a world as harsh as this, threads of mercy and belonging can still weave themselves into the threads of despair. By morning, the wind had relented, and pale light spilled across the plains. The woman began to move, her voice rising in faint words that Caleb could not comprehend. Slowly, her dark eyes opened, and for the first time, she met the gaze of the man who had pulled her from death. There was fear in those eyes, and vulnerability, but also a resilience that spoke volumes. Against the odds, she was alive. Caleb sank down beside her, brushing a hand across the blanket. "Easy now," he said quietly, knowing she might not understand the words, but hoping she would recognize the kindness in his voice. The woman spoke again, a name, a plea, a sound that came from deep within. Caleb could only nod, placing a hand upon his chest to offer his own name, Caleb. In that quiet moment, amid the crackling of the hearth and the soft whine of Buck resting nearby, a fragile bridge was built between two wounded souls. The woman had run from a brutal fate, and the wilderness had delivered her to the doorstep of a man who had long ago stopped hoping for anything more than silence. Yet here, in this tiny cabin, surrounded by the snow and the silence of the mountains, a new chapter was about to be written. The days that followed felt like threads of a slow, delicate weaving. The woman, the Apache woman he had found nearly buried in the snow, was beginning to stir from the edges of death. At first, she spoke little, her voice rising in faint, fragmented words Caleb could only guess at. Yet the silence between them spoke volumes. In that silence, trust was growing like an ember in the ashes. He tended to her wounds with hands hardened by work but softened by mercy. The gashes and bruises upon her skin spoke of cruelty he didn't understand, but that he felt deeply. As she gained strength, she began to move around the room, brushing long, raven hair from sharp, wary eyes, her posture wary and wary still, like a wounded animal ready to run. Yet she didn't. Somehow, she chose to stay. Caleb gave her space, never pressing, never reaching for more than a glance. At night, she would huddle by the hearth, wrapped in the blankets he offered, Buck resting at her side like a loyal protector. The dog had taken to her in a way that softened Caleb's heart. Buck had witnessed death and loss too, and perhaps in this woman, he recognized another living being weathered by the wilderness. Together, man and dog offered silence and warmth, and that was enough. It was one morning, with the mist still rising from the pines, that she spoke her name. The sound came like a whisper upon the wind. "Nita," she said, placing a hand upon her chest. Caleb had paused, the rough wooden spoon he held hovering in the air, and met her gaze. "Nita," he repeated, voice deep and slow. The faint hint of a smile curved her lips as she gave a single, sharp nod. In that moment, the distance between them felt like it had narrowed, and he felt a warmth rising in the stillness of the room. Through gestures and the few words of Apache he remembered from long ago encounters, Caleb learned fragments of her story. Nita was running, fleeing from a raiding party that had taken her family and left only terror in their wake. The marks upon her arms and legs spoke of shackles, of struggles and nights spent in the grip of cruelty. Somehow, in the heart of that darkness, she had found the strength to escape. To run until the wilderness embraced her. Until it brought her to him. Each night, as the stars winked down upon the mountain, Nita would whisper soft prayers to gods Caleb didn't know, and he would listen. Not because he understood, but because it felt like the right thing to do. He tended the fire, he kept watch, and in those moments, the boundaries of language dissolved. What spoke between them was the crackle of the flames, the quiet sound of breath, the threads of belonging being stitched between hearts that had long ago stopped hoping for belonging. As the days passed, Nita grew stronger. The color returned to her cheeks, and the wary tension that lived in the set of her shoulders began to fade. In those moments when she smiled, shy, almost tentative, Caleb felt a warmth rise within him that he hadn't felt in years. To Buck, this was a return to belonging, and the dog would often rest beside Nita, tail beating the floor, nose pressed to her hand. But the wilderness was never still. The wind that whipped across the plains carried whispers of those who hunted Nita. Dark riders, men fueled by greed and cruelty. They came closer every night, their trail faint upon the fresh snow, but growing stronger as the days passed. Buck would rise at midnight, ears pricked, a low growl humming in his chest. Caleb felt the tension, felt the weight upon the air. It was only a matter of time. One morning, when the sun rose crimson upon the mountains, Nita spoke sharply. Not in words he understood, but in the universal language of fear. Through gestures and the urgency in her voice, she made it clear, the men who hunted her were near. They would come for her. They would kill him for harboring her. And they would claim her for themselves. Caleb stood upon the porch, rifle in hand, gazing across the mist-clung fields. The wind carried faint echoes of hoofbeats upon the hard earth. He felt no fear, not for himself, but for the woman who had found a refuge here, and for the fragile ember that had ignited between them. The wilderness had shaped him, hardened him, molded him into a man who refused to run. Whatever came for Nita came for him as well. That evening, as the sun sank low and the mountains blushed with its light, Caleb set out a line of snares upon the perimeter of the forest. Buck followed, nose pressed low, ears sharp for the sound of riders. Nita watched from the doorway, wrapped in a shawl that was far too thin for the bitter wind. Yet she refused to stand idle, refused to hide. Together, she and Caleb prepared. That night, as the stars shimmered upon the dark dome of the world, the silence was broken by a sound that shook the earth, the sound of hooves, of men calling out to one another. Shadows emerged upon the horizon. Buck rose with a growl, and Caleb drew forth the rifle, checking the chamber with a hand that had long ago learned precision. Nita pressed herself to the doorframe, her voice rising in a soft prayer. Yet in the depths of those dark eyes was a flame that refused to be extinguished. Whatever came upon this land tonight would find that it was protected. Not by guns alone, but by the will of two wounded people who had found belonging in one another. The first shot rang out upon the plains, a crack that shattered the silence of the wilderness. Caleb sank low upon the porch, rifle pressed tight to his shoulder, Buck barking and charging forth into the mist. Nita drew a long, curved blade from beneath her shawl, a relic of a heritage that refused to be buried. Together, amid the falling snow and the rising cries of approaching riders, the widower and the Apache woman stood as one. Through the long, brutal hours of the night, the sound of rifle and steel rang out across the wilderness. The attackers came like a storm, brutal and hungry. Yet the small, secluded cabin became a fortress of resilience. Buck sank teeth into those who came too close, barking wildly until the mist was torn apart by rifle blasts. Nita, strong and fierce despite the pain that still weighed upon her, refused to stand idle. Together, she and Caleb became a force shaped by loss and tempered by survival. As the sun rose upon the aftermath of the night, silence fell upon the land. The snow was streaked with crimson, the mist rising from earth now marked by the cost of belonging. Caleb sank to a knee, exhausted but alive. Buck pressed close, whining quietly as if checking upon the man he had long called his companion. Nita, a blade still clenched within shaking hands, sank beside him. In that moment, upon the cold, quiet earth, surrounded by silence and the faint sound of the wind brushing the pines, Caleb and Nita met one another's gaze. In those dark, luminous eyes, he found more than desperation. He found belonging. Not belonging dictated by words or circumstance, but belonging born of resilience. Of loyalty, of a bond that refused to break, no matter the cost. He rose, brushing the snow and crimson from his hands, and offered a hand to Nita. Slowly, she placed hers upon it, rising to stand beside him. Together, with Buck pressed close, the three turned toward the tiny cabin that rose like a beacon upon the wilderness. Not a monument to loss or tragedy, but to belonging that refused to yield. The wilderness had shaped this chapter, and as its silence embraced them, a quiet understanding passed between the three. They were no longer lost. They were home.